without further ado, we will move on to presentation from CFI's CEO and President, Ron Lindsay. He has a PhD in philosophy from Georgetown University, a law degree also from the University of Virginia. However, he refuses to confirm the rumor that he is currently pursuing an MD from Johns Hopkins. Ha. How many degrees can one have? You have time, right? But he will confirm that his book, The Necessity of Secularism, Why God Can't Tell Us What to Do, is being released by Pitchstone Publishing in early December, and we will be organizing some campus and community tours in December through about March. So some of you will be getting contacted by us, particularly those in Florida and Texas, about bringing in Ron Lindsay for a talk. Please join me in welcoming Ronald Lindsay.
Hey. Thank you. Thank you. I assume the audio's okay, unless someone tells me differently. Okay, great. First of all, thank you. Thank you for joining us at the CFI Leadership Conference. The fact that you're here already shows a commitment to the cause of humanism, which is encouraging. And the fact that you're here at 9:15 on a Sunday morning shows a really strong, dedicated commitment to the humanism, because presumably, last night was an occasion for prolonged discussion, right? That's what humanists do on Saturday evenings. Actually, I was slated to schedule my talk a little later this morning. I don't think it was going to be last, but maybe next to last. But when I told Debbie Goddard, our tremendous Vice President for Outreach, and by the way, the whole outreach team has done a great job again in organizing this conference. I think every year I get astounded at how well the conference has come off. So again, this year, great job. Anyway, Debbie, we'll have a round of applause. So when I told Debbie I wanted to speak about the scope of humanism, she and I have a pretty open relationship and very honest with each other. And she just said, Ron, I don't know. Don't know if we can't count on you not to kick off some kind of controversy or firestones, or we're thinking maybe of scheduling you at 7 a.m. Turned out that didn't work out, so I hope everyone understands I'm being facetious. Nothing like that took place, And in fact, how could it, right? Because I have such a narrow topic, what could possibly go wrong, right? So what is the scope of humanism? I think first of all, we have to ask a few preliminary questions, right? One thing we might ask, is humanism a way of looking at the world? Is it a way of analyzing the world? In other words, is it a methodology? I think there may be something to that, right? At least in part. Is it a way of making us better persons? And if so, how do we define what better is? Some people have said that, humanism transforms you. There may be something to that. Here's another one I think maybe is put forward more often. Is humanism about a specific set of objectives or principles? Such that, for example, if someone endorses X and Y but not Z, we can say they're not a humanist. So let's say someone endorses same-sex marriage, reproductive autonomy, but doesn't like gun control or doesn't believe in universal health care. Does that mean that person's not a humanist? Well, it's something we should think about. But probably the most important question, but also interestingly, I think, the easiest question to answer is, who defines humanism? And I think you guys know the answer to that already. We define it. Humanism is nothing if not a collective enterprise. Because here I'll start beginning with my kind of fundamental building blocks to show where I'm going. And I think the place to start is to recognize this. There are no authorities to which we must defer in humanism. We do not have sacred texts. We do not have holy scriptures. We don't have popes, don't have bishops, don't have imams, don't have rabbis. don't have cult leaders, maybe some aspiring cult leaders, but no, we don't have cult leaders. And sure, we have, statements of principle, statements of position. There have been various humanist manifestos. I've lost track of the count. There's like Humanist Manifesto 1, Humanist Manifesto 2, 3, Secular Humanist Declaration, Humanist Manifesto 2000. There was a Neo-Humanist Manifesto, I think. There might have been a Neo-Humanist Manifesto. Just about every issue of free inquiry has affirmations of humanism. And sure, humanists, for the most part, will endorse all or at least part of those statements of principle. But the reality is, those statements of principle, those manifestos, don't have any force of authority beyond their own persuasiveness. And sure, there are humanist leaders, right? Because we have humanist organizations. I suppose I'm a humanist leader. Does that mean I have some authority? Yeah, sure, I have some authority. Among other things, I have the pleasant and very enviable task of, right now, in fact, you can go to my office and confirm this, of reviewing a roughly 8-inch stack of financial statements that, as an organization, we have to file every year. So I get to do that. I get to prepare budgets, also to approve or reject requests for special expenditures, reject requests for special expenditures, reject requests for special expenditures. You get the idea. But the thing that really gets me going every morning, the thing that gets me out of bed and energizes me, is always a prospect of being able to arbitrate personnel disputes, because that's something I just love, right? Again, I'm being somewhat facetious. Yeah, I do have authority, right? Because any organization, ultimately, decisions have to be made, especially an advocacy organization. And we do work very collaboratively here. And I'm going to start to talk about Michael DeDore, who's the head of our Office of Public Policy, Nick Little, legal director, Ed Beck, who is our senior policy analyst. We rely actually on the whole staff. We get input from outreach. We get input from our branches, who keep us informed of what's happening on the ground in Indiana or Michigan. And but at the end of the day, yeah, someone has to make a decision about what are we going to say about this issue or that issue. We issue press releases, we issue alerts, we issue statements of position, and I get to sign off on those. But that's organizational authority. That's not authority over the cause of humanism. And yes, CFI holds itself out as a humanist organization, but humanists can, and shockingly, sometimes do disagree with the statements of position that CFI takes. So what I'm going to say here today about the scope of humanism or the cause of humanism should be, this should be apparent to everyone, doesn't have any special authority behind it, has no more authority or force other than the persuasiveness of the words that I speak. So in emphasizing the lack of holy text or authority figures, I think I'm already suggesting, though, one critical element of the cause of humanism, and that is our commitment, our unwavering commitment to free inquiry and free expression. Nothing should be immune from critical examination, including our own beliefs, right? We cannot make progress. I've already covered that. We cannot make progress unless we're free to exchange ideas and question beliefs. And this implies no disrespect to the person whose beliefs we're questioning, whether they're outside humanism or inside humanism. To the contrary, it shows respect for that person. It shows that we think that person is someone who has the capability of defending and explaining their beliefs. So yes, we should question what people say. But in questioning others, in critically examining their beliefs, we also have an implicit obligation as humans, do we not? Something that follows from what I've already just said. I've stated we have no authority figures, no dogma. Humanism is not a religion. It's not an ideology, certainly not in the sense that Marxism or fascism are ideologies. Again, the persuasiveness of our views depends upon the strength of our evidence and our reasoning. So if we are humanists, I submit, we are committed to evidence-based reasoning. Careful empirical inquiry matched with rigorous logic is what we aspire to. Doesn't mean we always achieve that ideal, but that's what we aspire to. Personal feelings of certitude, sweeping generalizations not tied to evidence, they don't count in humanism. I'm going to pause here to make two observations. One really, I think, pretty directly related to my main thread. One more of a side observation, but nonetheless something important. One has to do with the extent to which we are committed to using evidence-based reasoning in various aspects of our lives. And that's something for which I think this organization maybe has been, unfairly criticized, maybe fairly criticized, I don't know. I just know I see on YouTube talks or speeches by various people in which they say, oh, CFI, what they try to do, they're like robots over there. Because what they say is, you have to apply reason and evidence in all aspects of the human endeavor. All aspects. Well, that's not true. Unfortunately, that was a tagline or a slogan that we used at one point in time, but it was officially discarded about 6 years ago. And why did we do that? Because frankly, it's kind of silly. Not only is it silly, but it's self-defeating. And it's incorrect. We don't have an obligation to use reason and evidence in all aspects of our lives. In fact, if you take that position, I think it's a position somewhat in tension with another key element of humanism, right? And that is our respect for personal autonomy. There are many choices that we make in life that are really a matter of personal taste. And science and reason don't enter into it, except maybe in the most indirect manner. You like chocolate ice cream, I like strawberry ice cream. Is one of us mistaken? Is one of us wrong? We're going to have an argument about that? Right? Yeah, okay, later. Anyway, but, and you could say, because I know I'm talking to humanists, so now I'll get pushback. Well, science enters into it because, you have to look at the sell-by date on the ice cream, and you have to check for mold, but, come on, really. And, there are a lot of things in life that really matter of personal preference. The clothes we wear, the friends we spend time with, what we like to drink, leisure time activities, the food we eat. Footnote, I know the, omnivore, vegetarian, vegan controversy, but I assume I'm an omnivore. I have certain tastes. I assume vegetarians prefer certain dishes to others and vegans, whatever. If you look at our lives, actually a large part of the time that we spend doing things are really matters of personal preference. And that's great, because we want to have a society like that where people have freedom to make those type of choices. I don't know how many of you were able to attend Women in Secularism 3. I hope a lot of you did. It was another great Women in Secularism conference. But I bring it up because at one point, Amanda Knief from American Atheists, I forget her exact title, Policy Director Office. She does a lot of things. And she's a great person, by the way. Anyway, there was some discussion that came up about philosophy. I don't know, maybe Rebecca Goldstein had gone before her or whatever. And Amanda quite candidly said, she doesn't care that much for reading philosophy. She, in fact, used a kind of colorful phrase about where Spinoza could place his lips or whatever. And then she went on to say that she actually preferred watching NASCAR. Okay, Speaking for myself, I think I'd rather sit on the tarmac in an unventilated plane next to a screaming baby, as opposed to watching cars go around the track for a couple hours, right? And what, with the hope that one of them will crash? I don't know. But I don't think I get less of Amanda. I would bring this up because we actually joked about it on Twitter. And I have personal preferences that people may not embrace. If you look at my Twitter homepage, if you aren't following me on Twitter, why aren't you? At R.A. Lindsay, right? And it's right up there. I say a president, CEO, CFI, I think philosopher, whatever. And I say Philadelphia Phillies fan. I'm a fan of Philadelphia Phillies. Yeah, go Phillies, right? I'm not a fanatic about it. I don't have time. I don't like to subscribe to Major League Baseball Network or whatever because I can't watch, everything. But every morning, virtually every morning, I do check to see how badly the Phillies lost the night before. Like last night, they blew it in extra innings to the Arizona Diamondbacks, 10-6, whatever. Among other things, it actually kind of makes me feel better to realize there's a bunch of overpaid multimillionaires who may feel even more miserable than I do that morning. So it's, it's a way of getting me going. But, I don't expect others to share that preference. On the other hand, I don't expect to be criticized for having that preference either. Point is, there's a large sphere of personal autonomy that each of us is entitled to have because, among other things, our preferences in these areas don't have any adverse effect on others. So when we say we're committed to evidence-based reasoning and rigorous logic, that applies to important issues and positions that lie outside the area of personal preference. Okay. Observation number 2 has to do with what I perceive as a failure of we humanists, and I say we, including myself, because, I'm fallible, I make mistakes, happens all the time. We're committed to evidence-based reasoning, but even on issues of some importance, we don't always adhere to that, that method. We humanists jump all over the religious whenever they say they're relying on faith. We say, oh, come on, that's so ridiculous. Accepting something without adequate evidence, what are you, in kindergarten? Accepting something maybe because others in your peer group accept it? Accepting something because you have some intuition about it and you think common sense dictates this? No one would say that unless, right? And you fill in the blank with some trite generalization. Accepting something based solely on second or third hand anecdotal evidence. Well, Joe told Molly, who told Tim, and I knew Tim from my years in the Gulf War, that he prayed and the tornado spared him, so I guess that means the tornado spared him. Well, Joe told Molly, who told Tim, who told me that Tom was drunk at last year's conference, so when I hear that, Tom was acting up at this year's conference, it had to be true, right? Think about some of the, I won't call them even debates, because they're not debates, just the back and forth we see on the internet all the time about allegations about this and that and what have you. Are all those discussions based on evidence-based reasoning? I think not. I'd like to propose here something that I'll call the habit of epistemological modesty. And you knew I was going to use that word, right? The PhD in philosophy, I have to use epistemology once in my talk. It was either that or metaphysics or deontology. I decided to go with epistemology. But you could just call it the habit of saying, I don't know, when you don't know, right? There really is nothing at all wrong about saying, I don't know. I'm not well acquainted enough with the facts of that situation to have an informed opinion about it. It's okay. Doesn't mark you out as someone who's not interested. Doesn't mark you out as someone who is ignorant, abysmally uneducatable or whatever. It just means you don't know about that situation. So if you don't have sufficient evidence about something, it's okay to admit that. And if that were to happen, I think the noise level on the internet would probably decline by half. But enough of that. I want to get back to my main thread now. We talked a bit about how we should approach issues. But what are the issues on which we should focus? What should draw our attention? Well, again, I think we already laid out one of them. One is the importance of preserving and promoting free inquiry. That's a key part of our agenda, because without that, we really can't make progress in any area. But beyond free expression. Well, here's a suggestion. And again, this is just a suggestion. So it's a little smaller than some of the PowerPoint screens, so I'll read it. We should work toward a society that gives all humans the ability to respect themselves and others, that recognizes the dignity of each individual, that ensures that all humans are entitled to equal consideration and equal standing in the moral community with the full panoply of political, social, and civil rights. I'm suggesting that's the scope of humanism. Now sometimes when I have discussions with religious people, and I'm sure you've had this discussion too, we criticize them for accepting things on faith. one that comes back, is they always say, well, you say you accept science. Science ultimately is a matter of faith, isn't it, right? Well, that's nonsense, and you know the arguments against that. I'm not going to get into it. But if they find out you're a humanist, then they really think they have you, because again, they'll point to the affirmations of humanism, humanist manifestos, and what they'll say is, look, you criticize us as being dogmatic. You guys are the same thing. You have your doctrines and dogmas. You just don't have a God. And where do you get these principles from? Where do you pull them from? What's your justification for them? So don't start criticizing us for having dogma. You have dogma too. So how about this? Does this have any justification beyond the kind of lofty rhetoric in which I phrased it? Actually, I think it does. In fact, I think it follows logically from what we've already discussed. If there are no holy books to which we must defer, if there are no authority figures, then none of us can claim a privileged position with respect to anyone else. None of us has an inherent right to claim a greater wisdom, a greater share of political or social power, a greater share of economic resources. Perhaps more fundamentally, none of us has a right to define and attempt to control another person's life for them. We have absolutely no right to tell anyone who or how they should love, who or where they should marry, whether or not they should have children, how they self-identify with respect to gender, or any other critical aspect of their lives. So this, what I have up here, this is not a dogma. To the contrary, it's a direct implication of removing the notion that there are dogmas that should control how we live. So I don't think this is something that has no justification. Rather, it's a direct implication of our viewpoint. We don't have authority figures. We don't have holy texts. We don't have dogmas. All right. So we have this rather broad statement of principle, this humanist ideal. So how is that reflected in the work we're doing? How should it be reflected in the work of humanist activists? Well, obviously, I'm best acquainted with CFI's work, so nothing I say here should be interpreted as criticism of the work of other humanists or atheists or skeptic organizations. Maybe upon self-examination, it will turn out to be critical, although I'm sure mildly critical, of CFI's work. But let's see. First of all, I think most of us would agree that religious identity is a critical aspect of a person's life. And freedom of conscience is a very important value. To respect someone, to honor that person's dignity, we have to allow that person to come to their own conclusions about God or the gods without any pressure, prodding, or oversight by the state. Likewise, that person should not be subject to any discrimination, legally, politically, civilly, or socially, merely because of their beliefs. And CFI works vigorously toward that end. A major portion of our work is devoted to promoting and preserving freedom of conscience for everyone, as Eddie emphasized last night. We don't want any special privileges for non-believers. We want all people to have equal rights to freedom of conscience. Now, we probably do spend more time protecting the rights of humanists and atheists, but I think that's justifiable, and not just on the grounds of self-interest. Because the fact of the matter is that in many countries, including the United States, being an atheist does make it more likely that you're going to be the subject of some form of discrimination. Maybe not legal discrimination, but ostracism, social discrimination. I mean, survey after survey indicates that atheists in the United States remain the most mistrusted, suspected group of people. I think the last Gallup survey indicated something like 43% of Americans would not vote for an atheist, a qualified atheist, for president, merely because they're an atheist. I mean, the only good news there is that percentage has gone down, from like 55% maybe 20 years ago to 43% now. And of course, the situation is far worse in other countries. Again, as other people discussed, Eric went over this, Eric from Canada. In other countries, being an atheist remains a crime. You can be sent to jail for it or something worse. So we do work on that because that's important. It's important for everyone. In addition, we work in general to keep religious doctrines from influencing public policy. This work, again, is implied by what we've said this morning. If we don't think dogma should guide us, obviously we don't think the dogma of the Catholic Church, or the Southern Baptist Convention, or the Church of Latter-day Saints, or of the Caliphate in Islam, right, should be influencing public policy. So we work very hard, for example, to maintain a secular public education. We work to keep official prayers out of the schools. We work to keep creationism out of the curriculum. We're opposed to vouchers as a means of funneling public money to support religious education. In fact, we work to maintain secularism across the board because secularism in public policy is compatible with respect for our fellow citizens, whereas dogma is not. And by secularism here, I don't mean atheism. Atheism is essentially another philosophical word. It's a metaphysical word in this sense. That's about the content of the universe, right? As an atheist, you're saying there's no God or gods, right? Secularism is not a metaphysical viewpoint. It's a political, ethical outlook. Essentially, it's the context in which discussions take place. And what we're saying as secularists is that when we have discussions, especially about public policy, we need to use reasoning and evidence. Evidence that's derived from this world, not supernatural revelation. And if we respect those who want to engage in democratic discourse with us, we will use the language of secularism. Because that's the only common language we have, if you think about it. That's the only way we can have meaningful discussions with anyone. Because as soon as you begin to bring in religious doctrine, or for that matter, ideological doctrine, as a justification for your position, you're effectively shutting out of the conversation anyone who doesn't accept that doctrine, right? You're talking about same-sex marriage, you start quoting the Old Testament and what have you, and it's an abomination. That's the end of the conversation. You can't go any further with that. So if we're to engage other people, we need to use the language of secularism, and that's why we emphasize in our public policy work, we need to have public policy grounded on secular considerations. What else do we do here at CFI? Well, as long as I've been familiar with CFI, and that goes back a long way, in fact, it goes back to before the time there was a CFI, because it was originally the Council for Secular Humanism and PsyCop. But in any event, the organization has been firmly committed to advocate for the rights of LGBT individuals. We strongly believe in LGBT equality across the board. Same thing with respect to reproductive autonomy for women. We believe in free access, availability to contraception and access to abortion. And when I say that, I just don't mean that it's legal to have an abortion. We work to try to make sure there are actually places that women can go to have an abortion as opposed to traveling 500 miles. And once again, these positions are implied by a rejection of dogma that tries to dictate to people how they should live their lives. One thing I always find a little interesting, if not amazing, is when the religious people claim that you have to have religion to have meaning in your life, right? You've heard this all the time, because atheists, if you're an atheist, you're condemned to a life of despair, nihilism, meaninglessness. You walk around all the time, or drag yourself around. I don't know. Let's think how that's supposed to work, okay? So for the religious, there's some vast cosmic plan of which they remain largely ignorant, other than the fact that they know they fit into it like some cog into a machine, right? And that's what gives their lives meaning. I guess I have a slightly different perspective on that issue. I think our lives have meaning to the extent that we can give shape and direction to our lives, that we have the ability to decide how we want to live our lives. And to have that ability, you have to have certain fundamental freedoms, including very basic things, such as deciding, whether or not to have children, who you want to live with, who you want to marry, whether you want to marry. These are fundamental freedoms you have to have, as I said, to decide how you want to live. And if you can't decide how you want to live, it does kind of put a kind of crimp on your ability to give meaning to your life. We also need to be able to exercise autonomy at the end of our lives as well. So CFI strongly supports assisted dying legislation. Those who are terminally ill often find themselves in intolerably painful or degrading conditions. Since the state controls the peaceful means of bringing about a quiet death, namely prescription medications, right? And violent means really are not a prudent or a realistic option for the terminally ill. For the state to deny patients the option of physician-assisted dying is effectively for the state to appropriate the lives of terminally ill patients, to compel them to live against their will. And here, once again, the biggest obstacle to reform are religious institutions and religious dogma. So from the topics I've just covered, you can tell we do a lot of work that relates in general to healthcare. And Michael, I know, and other people talked about it. One reason we launched a campaign to keep healthcare safe and secular. You know by now there's a website devoted to that campaign, so I'm not going to discuss the details of that campaign this morning. I'll limit myself to mentioning one other issue where we do a significant amount of work, and that's in the area of critiquing alternative medicine. You know, CFI is a humanist organization, but we're also a skeptic organization, and we do not see any incompatibility between being a humanist organization and pursuing what is sometimes referred to as scientific skepticism. You know, some people do perceive an inconsistency. You know, I just had some discussions recently on the internet with various people, you know, and what they say is, you know, oh, CFI, we have this mushy, confused, mixed message, you know, you're a humanist or you're a skeptic, what's the deal, right? You know, I think there was one comment I saw recently that said, well, this person really prefers to have an organization that has a laser-like focus, right? A laser-like focus on certain very specific issues. Well, I mean, what are you going to say? If that's the person's preference, that's fine. If your idea of trying to have an impact on society is to have the same level of impact that you would have with a laser pointer, that's fine, right? Maybe if you point that laser long enough, you'll find, no, I won't say that. I was going to say you find Bigfoot in the woods. That'd be a cheap crack. But the point is, maybe you burn a hole through a dowsing rod or something. We at CFI have somewhat wider ambitions. And we don't see any inconsistency there. Because again, if you're a humanist, as we've already talked about this, you're already committed to scientific skepticism. You approach issues through critical thinking and evidence-based reasoning, and that applies to dogma and untested or untestable claims of any sort. And alternative medicine is one area that's rife with unproven or untestable claims, and furthermore, it's a set of practices that cause significant harm to individuals. So accordingly, we believe that fits comfortably within the scope of our work as a humanist organization. So have I given you an exhaustive list of the things on which we should work? No, first of all, I'm sure I've left off things that we're currently working on right now because I haven't, committed them to memory, but it's a representative sample. But furthermore, I think this is important. I think this follows from what we've already said. There is no predetermined limit to the scope of humanism. Sure, there are practical limits, right? Because there are always priorities. Priorities given our resources, given time and money. We can't do everything. Wish we could. Our budget, and this is public knowledge, you can go online, look at our 990s. Annual budget is between $5 and $5.5 million a year, which for a humanist organization is fairly significant. But if you look at, like, for example, religious right organizations, just one organization, focus on the family, and that's it. They focus on their idea of the family, $90 million that they can spend. We engage in legal advocacy. We have one lawyer on staff. We rely on volunteer lawyers. Obviously, Eddie's a big help. I help out on briefs. But the Beckett Fund, for example, the organization that was heavily involved in the Hobby Lobby case, just one of the religious right legal groups, their budget's over $10 million. Alliance Defending Freedom, I think that's the name. I think they're over $20 million. the American Center for Law and Justice. I love these names, by the way, because they're so misleading. It's like over $25 million. They have a lot of resources. I wish we had those resources. That's a kind of polite way of saying, if you have money to give us, please give us money, right? Really. Because I want us to be able to expand what we do. Because there are issues out there that deserve our attention. And again, it's a question of what we can do in terms of the time that's available to us, right? Because again, if we go back to what I said was essentially the scope of humanism, any obstacle to all humans enjoying equal standing and equal consideration in the community is, I would argue, an appropriate object of humanist concern. And that's the question we should ask when we ask, what is the scope of humanism? Is there some obstacle out there, some legal impediment, some social impediment that we can address as a humanist organization that will ensure that groups or individuals enjoy equal standing and equal consideration? Let's just pick two examples, two kind of obvious examples, racism and sexism. My viewpoint is they are persistent, refractory problems, continue to be very critical problems in our society. Other societies too, but let's just focus on American society. Now that's not to say that, things are like they were in the 50s and 60s. Yeah, things have improved. And I don't pick 50 years ago as kind of just a number on my hat. 50 years ago, as everyone was aware, that's when the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed. People called that the Bill of the Century. It probably was. Tremendously important piece of legislation. Tremendously important when you think of how horrible the situation was beforehand, and when you think that this country, which stands for freedom and democracy, had states where people couldn't choose where to go to have a meal, where to rest at night, what school to attend to, simply because of their race. I mean, it was disgusting, right? In some sense, though, and I want to make sure here I'm not misquoted, because I want to make sure you know what sense I'm talking about. In the sense of identifying how to address that issue, it was easy to pick out the objective. Not easy to get there by any means, because, again, very sad and tragic history. People died. People had dogs set on them. People were beaten to get those rights. So it was a very difficult struggle. But the object was clear. The object changed that law, changed that ridiculous, abhorrent, hateful law so that people, at least before the law, have equal standing. And we've done that. Not to say the laws work perfectly, but the law has changed at least. But now we're faced with a situation that's more subtle. We have structural discrimination. Now again, as a humanist, I listen to people with other viewpoints, so if someone says there isn't a problem there, fine, tell me why there isn't. But we're also empiricists. We believe in the importance of statistics, and just to take one example, again, example familiar to many people, the rate of incarceration for African American males is incredibly disproportionate to that of other races. So there's something that's going on there, right? There's an explanation. It's not something that happens by chance. One difficulty, of course, is to identify exactly what the causes of that are. Is it, bias among juries, bias among judges? Is it laws that are applied unequally? Does it happen at the street level with police arresting African Americans where they wouldn't arrest whites? There are arguments being made, I think with some justification, that we have effectively a pipeline from school to jail because the disproportionate treatment of African Americans begins in school. All these things are, I think, valid points, require study, require action. But we have to face it, they're more difficult to address than simply a law in the books that's there and everyone can say, well, this law is absurd, we need to get rid of it. So it's going to be difficult to address structural discrimination. But I don't think difficulties excuse us from making the attempt, again, if we have the resources to do so. And I'd like to have the resources to do so. But of course, at the end of the day, it's going to be you guys, as I said at the beginning, and everyone else who professes to be a humanist who's going to determine the scope of humanism. I've talked a lot this morning about the importance of autonomy and personal freedom, freedom to make decisions without the dictates of dogma. But with that freedom comes responsibility. Comes the responsibility to give serious consideration to ethical and moral issues. You know, one advantage the religious have over us, and again, I don't want to be too dismissive of them, but it's true. You know, if you think about it, religion is a time-saving device, right? Do you want to know what to do? You go to the church, the temple, the mosque, whatever. You go to the Bible, the Quran. Boom, the message is there for you. Don't have to think that hard about it. That's the message. That's not true when you sign on as a humanist activist. I'm not giving you the message. Debbie's not giving you the message. Eddie's not giving you the message. Yeah, we have ideas we want you to consider. But you have to shape the message. And that can not only be a time-consuming task, but occasionally it can be a very frustrating and disappointing task, because again, you have to rely on persuasion. And if this hasn't happened to you already, I guarantee it will happen to you maybe more often than you want. You'll be talking to someone. I'm not talking to someone who's outside the humanist community. I'm talking about someone who's inside the humanist community. You're going to have a discussion with someone about some issue, and you're going to go on for 15, 20, 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours. And you're going to be there sitting thinking, what is it? What's happening here? Why can't I get through to this person? Is this person just so obtuse and thick-headed that he just doesn't get it? Right? But enough about people who have to talk with me. Because the reality is you're going to find that in discussions with a lot of people in the humanist community. And all you can do is rely on the force of your arguments and your evidence. Because you don't have any greater privilege, any greater authority than anyone else. But that's a good thing. Because what is the alternative to talking? The alternative to talking is dogma. The alternative to talking is forcing someone. The alternative to talking is commanding someone. The alternative to talking, ultimately, is violence. And that's something we reject as humanists. So, I hope I haven't discouraged too many people here, right? But I assure you, it's not too late to leave. I know you came here for this conference, but stay for lunch, if you want to. But, you can back out now. And I promise we won't tell anyone you were here. It'll be our little secret. But I really hope you don't do that, because we need you. I hope you will remain with us. I hope you'll let your voice be heard. I want you to be part of the community that determines the scope of humanism. Because ultimately, the cause of humanism is the cause of humanity. And yes, you're going to find it very aggravating at times, but I guarantee you will also find it very rewarding. And I can't think of any more meaningful commitment, any more meaningful cause than the cause of humanism. Thank you again for being here. I hope I used enough time so I don't have to answer questions. No, not really.
We can go on, or you can take a couple of questions.
Yeah, sure.
A bit over time. A few?
I just wanted your perspective. The slide that you had, we should all work towards society. I'm not going to reiterate the entire slide, but the long slide that you read to us.
Right.
You said moral community. Could you give me a better idea of what you define as morality and what is good and bad?
Wow. I actually have an article in Free Inquiry. No, really not to put, I mean, you know, it will lay out, I think, in probably much more coherent terms and sufficient detail of how I see morality. By the way, I actually changed that at the last minute, not to prejudge things, because I originally had instead of moral community, human community, but then I thought, well, what about people who believe in animal rights? Don't want to prejudge that issue, so just kind of left, that's why the phrasing's there. I think we need to look at morality essentially, here's the wrong way to look at morality, as kind of a set of commands from someone, because that's how it's, you know, traditionally that's how it's been based in most human societies until contemporary times. There's some, usually a deity, right? That's the giver of the laws and what have you. Instead, I think we need to back up. And, you know, that gives then the religious an argument for saying that atheists, they can't have objective morality because, you know, they admit there's no authority, right? There's no holy text or whatever, so how do you determine what's right or wrong? Back up and try to think about what functions morality serves. Why do we have these institutions, these practices, these norms? What do they allow us to do that we wouldn't be able to do otherwise? And if you look at it that way, I think you'll see there's, you know, a certain objectives that morality fulfills. I mean, one of the key objectives is it allows us, when it works, to live together in peace. It allows us to cooperate with each other, to collaborate with each other, to work together to modify harmful conditions, provide security. All those things are very important to build trust, right? So I look at morality as, some people would say it's a pragmatic approach. I'm not sure labels are that important. The point is, I look at, you know, what helps us to live together and progress. And that's why we have these norms. And how do we determine what norms to have? Well, first of all, again, if you study human culture, there's a set of core norms that, you know, all human communities have shared. If you're to live together in peace, you can't say, well, it's okay to kill someone if I don't like them, right? Or maim them or what have you, right? You don't need the 10 Commandments to tell you that, you know? That's kind of a basic thing, right? Of course, there are more complicated issues than that. And so when you get to complicated issues, including novel issues, you know, because we face issues now that people in Neolithic times didn't face, you know, they didn't have to worry about what are the implications of organ transplants, stem cell research, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of bioethical issues are new. I think the starting point is to try to figure out how does this relate in some way to the core norms? What's the rationale behind those core norms? Have the circumstances changed, so we have to modify the core norms in a certain respect? What would be the consequences of doing that? So you look at things that, and again, as a humanist, there are no snap answers. You have to take time and consider them. Let me take the assisted dying example again, because it's something I'm familiar with. So many people object to that because they say, look, it's a fundamental thing. You can't kill someone. And they look upon assisted dying, assisted suicide as killing. They say, you know, the physician is killing the patient. Not true from a number of different levels, but, you know, leave that aside. Why do we have the prohibition against killing someone? I mean, to ask that question, I mean, it seems almost silly to ask it, but, you know, people want to live, right? I mean, that's right. People want to live. In almost any circumstance, people want to live, because to be alive is necessary to do anything else. Kind of an obvious thing. And again, if we had a society in which people could kill with impunity, that society would dissolve right overnight. But there could be circumstances in which the underlying rationale for that norm doesn't apply. Because the person may be at the end of their life, they'll be dead maybe in a few months anyway, and the question is, are they going to be having a slow, agonizing death or a quiet, dignified death? And if the person is competent to make that choice for themselves, then I think we have an exception. Again, I don't even think of assisted dying as killing, because it's not. But so I guess that's how I approach, and I would approach any moral issue that way. You know, you start off with the kind of basic norms on which people agree. You work from there. You see the consequences of applying the norms. And again, the key thing, the thing I think most people miss is you got to look at the underlying rationale. What's the purpose of having that norm, and does that rationale apply in this instance? So, hope that answers your question.
Thank you for your insight.
Thanks.
You talked about freedom of consciousness and being able to live out your conscience. A lot of religious people use that same excuse to defend bigotry in some sense. So how would you address the difference between when you say it as a secular humanist and when religious people say that they're just following their conscience when they do the things they do?
Freedom of conscience means the freedom to believe, what you want to believe about the gods or gods, right? And to a certain extent, the freedom to exercise that belief. We certainly don't oppose people having worship services or praying, not obviously in government institutions or whatever, but people want to pray in their homes, people can pray silently, or what have you. Freedom of conscience doesn't mean you have a right to impose your will on someone else. And I think that's the difference, the key difference between how some religious people interpret freedom of conscience and how we would interpret it. To take the Hobby Lobby case, for example. To me, that was a complete distortion and misuse of the concept of freedom of conscience. Freedom of conscience protects you, again, there could be certain exceptions, but just broadly speaking, from being forced to do something to yourself against your religion. So if you think, for example, that you should not take birth control because it's a sin or whatever, we're not going to force you to take birth control, right? We don't want to do that. But that's not what was at stake in the Hobby Lobby case. No one was forcing the owners of Hobby Lobby to take the pill, right? What they wanted to do was to impose their religious views on their employees. And that, as I said, is a misuse of the concept of freedom of conscience. So when we say freedom of conscience, we're talking about the right of the individual, decide what you want to decide about the gods. You're free to practice your own religion. You're free to refrain from doing this or whatever to the extent it affects you personally, but you can't impose your views on third parties.
Thank you.
Okay.
We'll have to move on, but thank you so much, Ron, for this. We really appreciate it.